Hello all. So I've been making some Eppp videos really discussing my journey to taking the Eppp. Now, in reviewing those videos, I noticed that I really didn't go in depth about how I studied once I joined PrepJet. I sort of talked about my journey getting to PrepJet, but I really didn't talk about my study habits and those sorts of things once I and joined PrepJet. Now, so I want to discuss that in this video. Now, first things first, I studied 2.5 hours a day and 7 days a week. There were very few days that I actually missed studying. There were some days where I was like, you know what, I'm going to take this day off and I'm not going to study at all. Now, I realized that everybody cannot do 2.5 hours a day. I was not working full time at the time that I was doing PrepJet. And so I was afforded that opportunity to be able to study for the 2.5 hours per day. So I guess that amounted to about 17.5 hours a day. It's really recommended that you do 15 to 20 hours per week, right? So 17.5 hours per week is what I was studying, not every day. So, so that was how long I studied per day and per week. Now, when I joined PrepJet, it is recommended, right, that when you're going through the summaries, to put the summaries into your own words. Now, for me personally, I had a hard time really putting it into my own words because I didn't want to reduce the information to an extent that I was missing important and key terms or things that I really needed to know for the test. So I wound up literally copying in my notes large amounts of the summaries. And then what I would do to sort of compensate for the fact that I really couldn't put it into my own words was that I would make up stories of the based upon the content. Or so, for instance, there were various parts of the brain when it came to the physiology section, right? And so what I would do is I would take various parts of the brain. I didn't do all of them this way, but I took a lot of the parts of the brain, and then I would make up stories based upon that, stories that I could really understand. And so I would include the section of the brain that it was that part of the brain was in, and then I would create a little story to help me remember what I was needing to know for the test about that part of the brain. And if you watch some of my other previous videos, when I was utilizing websites and those sorts of things, I was studying aspects of the brain that were, I guess, a part of the Eppp, but it wasn't the specific part of the aspect of the brain that I was supposed to be studying. And so what PrepJet did a really good job is really honing in on the part of the brain that you were supposed to know and the information on that part of the brain that you were supposed to know. So again, making up stories was big for me, especially when it came to parts of the brain, and especially when it came to classifications of medication. If you notice, certain classifications of medication, they some of the endings are the same, and so I really honed in on any sort of patterns within classifications of medications that I could. If there was any sort of endings that were really the same, or the beginnings of the medications were similar, that I would really try to hone in on that and find that pattern, because I really wanted to try to understand that, okay, this classification, if I see the ending of this, medication, then I know it's this class of medications. So I would really try to hone in on any sort of patterns within medications that I saw. And then I could remember, okay, this is a benzodiazepine, or this is a barbiturate, and now I know what these do. And so that's why I tried to find those patterns. So again, stories for medications, stories for various parts of the brain. That's one of the things that helped me. Spaced repetition and active recall really helped me as well. again, trying to put this stuff in my own words, I found it difficult. So a lot of the information, you're just going to have to try to get it down and remember it. There's just really no other way to go about it than to just memorize it. And so, in order to help me memorize information, I utilized active recall and spaced repetition. And so, active recall, of course, being when you're literally trying to recall information about a particular topic from your memory. And what helps me with that is to space that out. So what I would do is like, let's just say I would go through the big six modules. I started on let's just say I started on clinical or physiology. I started on physiology, right? So um, when I would finish a particular module within the physiology section, when I moved on to the next module, I would go back to module one and recall my notes. I would go back and study my notes again. And then when I would move on to the third module within that section, I would go back to sections 1 and 2 and go back over the information. Then I would try to remember. I would look at a particular term, and then I would go back, in my memory and say, okay, this is this part of the brain is in this section of the brain. Are the things that it does, and so on and so forth. This is that active recall. So that's what I utilized: spaced repetition and active recall. Now, when I moved on to another section, like let's just say clinical, when I would do my notes for clinical, I would always go back to physiology and make sure that I go back and study over those physiology notes. And then I would active recall my physiology stuff. And then when I moved on to another section, organizational psych, I would go back to clinical. I would go back to physiology, try to active recall. I would review my notes. And so that's that spaced repetition, because I know that I'm going to forget some information, but if I can keep making sure that I recall that information, and I can keep making sure that I space out my studying of those previous modules, then it would stick. And so those are things that help me. So I made up stories. I used spaced repetition and active recall. Now, one of the things to reduce, because PrepJet is very efficient, right? And so while some of the other test prep companies, there is so much information on there that it's overwhelming. I'm not saying any particular one, but what the summaries did a really good job of is really condensing the information down to really what you need to know for the test. And so I would go back, like I said, do the spaced repetition and active recall, but then there were still times where the information was so much, or I just really could not understand something. So then that was when I utilized things like ChatGPT to help me. Like if there was a concept that I just could not understand based upon the summary, I would ask ChatGPT about it to just break it down in my mind. And so there weren't a lot of times where I had to do that, but there were certain times where I was like, I just can't wrap my mind around some of the material. But again, PrepJet does a really good job of condensing so much information down into those summaries, right? So those were my strategies: writing stories about parts of the brain, writing stories about some of the medication, noticing patterns within those medications, spaced repetition, active recall, and when I needed it, using ChatGPT to sort of rephrase certain things for me so I could really understand the material. Again, if you were to use PrepJet, and PrepJet is not sponsoring, and I'm not even necessarily advocating that you use PrepJet. This is just what I did. Now, I did 3 months. I joined PrepJet on October 4th, and then I took the test on January 6th. So it was almost 3 months to the day that I utilized PrepJet and took the test. Obviously, if you watch my other videos, you'll know some of the other things that I was doing. I was on various websites. Those did not help me for the test. It helped me in certain ways to become from just introducing me to parts of the brain and introducing me to things that I didn't know before, but it just really wasn't giving me what I needed specifically for the test.